The skin is an incredible organ with multiple functions, and is actually the largest organ of the human body. And here's a dissection of real human skin from the mid-back of a male cadaver. And you'll notice that it has a certain thickness, a certain pigment, and even some areas that my aesthetic students are quick to point out as sun damage that you can see from these multiple spots scattered throughout. Now, much of the sun damage, or many of the lesions created by sun damage, are benign, meaning they don't really cause much of a problem beyond you maybe not liking how they look. But sun damage can lead to more serious lesions that are considered cancerous. And these skin cancers actually only arise from this top paper-thin layer that we refer to as the epidermis, rather than that thicker second layer called the dermis. So we're gonna go into the epidermis and show you why and how skin cancers arise from this layer, discuss the most common types of skin cancer and which one can actually be deadly. We'll also talk about how moles, sunspots, and freckles work. And of course, I'll have to sprinkle in some other really awesome functions of the skin, like how it waterproofs you. It's going to be a fun one. So let's do this. So here we have a picture of the skin to help us with our skin cancer story. And here we have the epidermis on top, represented in pink. Then the second layer down, we have the dermis in blue. And it's the epidermis and the dermis that combine to form the true skin. But we do have a third layer here represented in yellow. This is called the hypodermis, sometimes referred to as the subcutaneous layer. And it's made out of fatty tissue. But this hypodermis will combine with the skin to complete the overall integumentary system. But again, we're just mostly going to focus in on the epidermis here with skin cancer. But before I zoom into the epidermis, I do want to mention that the epidermis is actually avascular, meaning it doesn't have a blood supply. And the reason for this, and what we're going to see when we zoom in, is that the epidermis is just cells stacked on top of each other, just packed together. And that means there's no room for tiny little blood vessels to weave in between those cells. And the reason I bring this up is because if you get an abrasion or a cut and you bleed, that means you had to go all the way through the epidermis down to the dermis where the blood vessels actually reside. But again, let's zoom in to say like this segment of the epidermis. So we have more of this microscopic view here. Again, you can see just cells stacked on top of each other, packed together, to the point where the epidermis can be over 50 cell layers thick in some areas of the body, which is kind of crazy to think about. When we looked at the cadaver dissection, the epidermis almost looked like it was paper thin. But when we look at these different cells, this is going to help us to understand the different skin cancer types, because we'll see certain skin cancers are problems with certain types of cells. Now, the cell that you're seeing the most of here are these pink cells called keratinocytes. And just to orient you before I go into that, me touching right there would be like me touching the top of, or the surface of my epidermis here. And down here, just remember, this is where the dermis and the blood vessels would be. But again, the epidermis is primarily made up of these pink cells called keratinocytes, keratin-producing cells that help these cells bind together. But 90% of your epidermis are these keratinocytes. And if we actually zoom in to, I should say, more like highlight this bottom row of cells, this bottom row of cells that make up the epidermis is referred to as the stratum basale. Now, there's going to be two skin cancers that we can learn about just by learning about this stratum basale. Basale just means bottom row, or the base, and think basale when we talk about a certain type of skin cancer. But if we look at this bottom row of keratinocytes, these keratinocytes are close enough to the blood supply in the dermis where they are mitotically active, meaning they can undergo cell division. So if we were to take a look at just one keratinocyte, but keep in mind all of these keratinocytes will participate in this, but if this keratinocyte copies itself, one of the copies is going to move up there. And then it will copy itself again, and the cell that was here will get pushed up and a new one in its place. And this process will continue until cells that were down here will eventually make it all the way to the top and flake off, contributing to the dust of your house. But it takes about a little less than a month for a cell to move from the bottom, the stratum basale, all the way to the top surface where it will flake off. But this is one of the extremely important functions of the stratum basale. It's this growth layer that's constantly replenishing your skin cells that make up your epidermis. But there's another very important cell when it comes to skin cancer located within the stratum basale, and that is the melanocytes that you can see in brown. Now, these melanocytes will stay in the stratum basale, or at least they should. And that's why these cytoplasmic extensions, or these arm-like extensions, are very important. Because one melanocyte can contact up to 30 keratinocytes in that stratum basale, and even some of the keratinocytes that have moved up a little bit. But these melanocytes, as their name implies, they produce melanin. And they're going to deposit this melanin in all the keratinocytes that they contact. And this melanin is a protective pigment that will surround the nucleus, specifically the part of the nucleus that is exposed to the surface or where the UV light can come in. And we're protecting really the DNA within that nucleus from UV damage, because if the DNA gets damaged in these cells, it could cause some mutations that cause the cells to behave erratically and potentially divide out of control, which could potentially lead to some of these skin cancers we're going to talk about. But what's really interesting about the melanin, remember, we said that 90% of the cells of the epidermis are those keratinocytes, and 8% are melanocytes, regardless of your skin pigment. So whether you have very, very light skin all the way up to very, very dark skin or anything in between, you'll still have about 8% melanocytes. So that means that when you have darker skin or darker skin pigments, it's just more melanin from the melanocytes that you have getting deposited into those keratinocytes. Now, all of us have a baseline amount of melanin that our melanocytes will produce without UV stimulation. So just if you never went out in the sun, you're going to produce some level of pigment. But obviously, if we go out in the sun, that's going to stimulate those melanocytes to produce even more melanin to dump into those keratinocytes, and those keratinocytes will get even darker, and we refer to that as a tan. Now, in just a second, we're going to talk about the specific types of skin cancer, but we'll also mention some of the more benign skin lesions caused by sun damage, such as hyperpigmentation and age spots. And so let's quickly talk about something that can help to reduce the appearance of some of these age spots, and that is with the Illumina LED face mask from the sponsor of today's video, iRestore. This is one of the most powerful LED masks on the market with clinically proven technology. And with more LEDs and face coverage than leading competitors, this mask is perfectly engineered for both efficacy and comfort. The Illumina has 360 medical-grade LEDs and is the only device that delivers red, infrared, and blue light therapy at the same time. And this is important because different wavelengths of light penetrate the skin at different depths, which means it can help with more superficial conditions that affect the epidermis, such as acne and sun damage, while also getting deeper into the dermis to help support better blood flow and collagen production, all leading to clearer, calmer, and more youthful looking skin. And thanks to enhanced eye protection and portable battery pack, it's clearly designed for multitasking while working, relaxing, and filming YouTube videos. And all it takes is 10 minutes, 3 to 5 days a week. This device is loved by women 25 and older who are looking to prevent aging and have more radiant skin. But guys, you definitely can use it too. So if you're looking to up your skincare routine, try the Illumina LED face mask today by clicking on the link in the description and use our coupon code IOHASKIN for a limited time discount of $205 off. And now, let's get back to skin cancer. But let's come back to this whole idea of these two types of skin cancers that the stratum basale helps us to explain. One, and you've probably heard of this skin cancer, is basal cell, stratum basale, but basal cell carcinoma. And basal cell carcinoma is a mutation or essentially cancer of these keratinocytes derived from the stratum basale. And when these cancerous basal cells start to divide out of control, they'll start to form these kind of mole-like lesions. One of the most common subtypes of basal cell carcinoma, they look like these pearly moles with kind of rolled edges or kind of a smushed out center. But there are other varying subtypes of basal cell carcinoma, so obviously a dermatologist would be the one to diagnose these specific subtypes and even just basal cell carcinoma in the first place. And basal cell carcinoma is the most common type of skin cancer out of the three we're going to talk about today. It accounts for about 78% of all skin cancers. But the next type of skin cancer that has to do with the basal or the stratum basale is malignant melanoma. And as that name implies, it's going to be a mutation or an overgrowth of these mutant melanocytes. Now, whenever you hear the word malignant, that's generally not a good thing, as malignant melanoma is the worst of these skin cancers because it can sometimes be deadly. And I want you to think, why would malignant melanoma potentially be more serious and more deadly than, say, like basal cell carcinoma or the other type of skin cancer that we're going to talk about? But before we go into that last type of skin cancer, let me cover some of these benign lesions that you've likely heard of or maybe even have some of your own, freckles and moles. Now there's two types of freckles that we'll cover. And the first type you'll see typically on light-skinned individuals, especially in kids. And these will cover the nose and the cheeks. And these types of freckles are called phyllides. And even though these freckles will tend to get a little bit darker with UV exposure like in the summertime, and then they tend to fade a little bit in the wintertime, they are not caused by UV damage. They're just this genetic thing that people will have, or they'll have an accumulation or a buildup of melanin in certain areas of the skin, typically over the cheeks and on the nose. But then we also have the type of freckle, or you could consider this a type of a freckle, that are caused by sun damage. And we showed you some of those on this skin dissection a little bit earlier, but I'll point them out again. These types of freckles or spots you can refer to as lentigines. Now, lentigines is kind of a funny name, but most people will refer to them as like sunspots, age spots, or even liver spots. But these also are an accumulation of melanin in these specific areas of the epidermis, except that lentigines is due to UV damage or UV exposure. Now, there's also the good old-fashioned mole. And so let's show you a different skin dissection here. And here you can see a mole here or a mole there. And the technical term for like a benign mole is just a nevus or nevi for plural. Now, how these form is from an overgrowth of the actual melanocytes. So think about the melanocytes overgrowing, and this is a benign growth, not like a cancerous growth like malignant melanoma, but they start to overgrow to the point where they kind of push upward into the epidermis, and that's what can cause that raised appearance that you'll see with these typical benign moles. But let's go back to the board here and talk about this last type of skin cancer, and you've likely heard of this skin cancer called squamous cell carcinoma. Now, remember how we learned that those cells in the stratum basale, they would move up towards the surface, but as they move up towards the surface, they start to flatten out and become more squamous. Squamous just means flat. And so when you're talking about squamous cell carcinoma, it's cancerous cells or these keratinocytes that are cancerous derived from higher up than the stratum basale. Typically, they're in this sublayer that I have highlighted called the stratum spinosum. Now, for those of you who love names, it's called the stratum spinosum because if you were to zoom into the cell membrane of these cells, you'd see that they were really starting to bind together with each other, and it creates this kind of pulled out or spiny edge to their cell membrane. And I'm going to come back to squamous cell carcinoma in just a second, but we've got to show you some cool other features of the next sublayer. So if you move up to the next sublayer, this is called the stratum granulosum. And if you look closely at these cells, you can see these little dots representing these little granules or these little sacs that are filled with lipids. And what will happen is that these little granules will spew out to the outside of the cell, and they contain lipids or oils. And so essentially, once these granules or these lipid sacs spew out onto the cells, let me go back to that, it'll coat the cells in oil, and we know the mortal enemy of oil is water. And so this is how you waterproof your skin. This is a great barrier to stop water from coming in, as well as just losing water outward through the skin. The only way we typically lose water out through the skin is through different pores that are like sweat glands. But we even have another cool sublayer called the stratum lucidum. This one's variable. Lucidum means full of light, and you only find the stratum lucidum on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And typically, if you look at somebody's palms or their soles, they tend to be a little bit lighter than, say, like on the dorsal surface of their hands and feet. Hence the name kind of lucidum, it's more full of light. But this just adds, again, extra thickness in these areas that you need it, like on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. And then the last sublayer, we have the stratum corneum, where the cells have fully flattened out. They've died off because they've moved away from the blood supply, but we've had this process of waterproofing and binding together. And this sublayer, like I said earlier, can be over 50 cell layers thick in some cases. And so this is the sublayer that's great for protecting us from friction and abrasion. Now, a lot of you have probably had a callus before. If you've had a callus on your feet or wherever you've had your calluses, this is when the stratum corneum starts to get thicker and thicker and thicker in response to friction and abrasion. But let's go back to this whole discussion on squamous cell carcinoma. Like I mentioned, it generally comes from mutated cells in the stratum spinosum as those cells are starting to flatten out. And often these squamous cell carcinoma lesions tend to be these kind of flaky, dry lesions. Again, just like basal cell carcinoma and malignant melanoma, there can be subtypes and variants of this. And so again, a dermatologist would be the one to specifically diagnose these. But let's also talk about some ways to prevent skin cancer, as well as some of the typical treatment strategies if someone does develop one of these cancers. It's probably not going to shock you that based on the cause of mutated DNA from UV exposure, that the main cause of these skin cancers is UV light. And so one of the best ways you can prevent this is limit direct exposure to UV light, especially if you have lighter skin pigment. Also using high quality sunscreens if you are going to go out in the sun. Now, I do want to be clear here. Yes, you do have a higher risk of developing skin cancer if you have a lighter skin pigment. That doesn't mean people with darker pigments cannot develop skin cancer. And sometimes that can be a little tricky because the darker skin can sometimes almost hide the skin lesions a little bit so people don't notice them as easily sometimes as if somebody has a lighter pigment. And so this is why it's important for everyone to, go to their annual physicals, get a skin check. That could be from their primary care provider if they offer it, or even checking with the dermatologist once a year to kind of do this head to toe exam of your skin, because the most important thing you can do if you develop skin cancer, or one of the most important concepts, is early detection. If you've heard some of our other cancer videos, you hear me say that phrase, early detection. Because the earlier you can detect cancer, whether it's skin cancer or any other cancer, that often tends to lend itself to better outcomes or a better prognosis. Now, we also previously mentioned that malignant melanoma tends to be much more serious than the other two and can sometimes lead to death, whereas squamous and basal cell are rarely fatal. But let's finally answer why that potentially is. Now, remember, with basal and squamous cell, we learned that this was a cancer of these keratinocytes. Yes, basal cell was derived from the stratum basale, and squamous cell was derived more from these sublayers that were higher up when the cells start to flatten out. But these keratinocytes have a tendency to grow upward, which is away from the blood vessels that are down below. And if we could pick a good thing about cancer, I guess that would be somewhat of a good thing in this case, having a tendency to grow away from the blood vessels, because one of the worst things that can happen with cancer is if those cancer cells get into the bloodstream and spread somewhere else. If they spread to a vital organ and start growing there, that often can lead to death. Now, malignant melanoma, those melanocytes don't have that tendency to grow upward. As the melanocytes start to divide and grow out of control, eventually, if they clump together and that clump of those cancerous melanocytes gets big enough, it could eventually seed into a blood vessel and spread to another portion of the body. And that's why malignant melanoma can sometimes lead to death, when it spreads to something or another organ that's more vital. Now, hopefully this video hasn't freaked you out with every little mole or skin lesion that you may have. And if you have anything that's concerning, obviously you'd want to see a qualified clinician. But there is this little mnemonic to help you kind of differentiate between certain moles that could be more benign versus serious. It's just simply ABCD. A stands for asymmetry. Cancerous moles tend to be more asymmetric. B stands for border, where the borders of that mole are irregular. C stands for color, like malignant melanoma can have a mixture of colors like black, sometimes even pinks and red. And then diameter. Malignant melanomas tend to be larger than 6 millimeters. And to give you a reference, a pencil eraser is about 5 millimeters, so something bigger than that. Now, some people will actually add an E to that, so it's A, B, C, D, and E. E standing for evolving or evolution, meaning you have some sort of lesion or mole that's changing rapidly. But again, if you have any concerns, best thing to do is see a qualified clinician. Typically, that's going to be a dermatologist, and just go to your annual exams every year. But hopefully you learned some really cool information about skin cancer and even some additional features about the skin. Thank you so much for watching and supporting our channel. We really do appreciate it. Like and subscribe if you feel the need. And of course, I'll see you in the next video.